The C100 is one of the most versatile video cameras you can buy for less than $1,000. It has almost every feature you need for recording professional video, whether that be documentary work, corporate video, music videos, and even story-based filmmaking. However, there's no such thing as a perfect camera, and the C100 is definitely no exception. There are a few issues with the C100 that may or may not be deal breakers, so please watch this entire video because it'll definitely help you decide if this camera is right for you. But without further ado, let's get into the Canon C100. So quick introduction, this camera was released in 2012. It's Canon's first camera in their C series cinema camera line. And so this camera has Canon's EF mount. It can record 1080p video up to 30 frames per second. However, it actually has a 4K Super 35 sensor. It just downscales the video to 1080p internally, which theoretically means it'll have sharper 1080p video quality than just a standard 1080p sensor. It has built-in ND filters at clear, 2, 4, and 6 stops, which are really nice for run and gun filming. So you don't have to throw on a variable ND filter up front, and every time you swap your lenses out, change the ND filter out or whatever you need to do. They're just built straight into the camera, which is really useful and one of the main selling points of this over something like a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. And as you can see right here, it comes with a top handle and a rotating side handle, as well as of course a bunch of buttons on the side, the front, the back, pretty much everywhere. This has a bunch of options for, of course, holding it, for mounting it, and for changing all of your settings right on the side of the camera. So overall, it's just a really ergonomic camera that's just meant to be as easy to access and as easy to use as possible. So when it comes to the video specs of the C100, like I said, it records 1080p video, and the 1080p video you get out of this camera is H.264 8-bit 420 video. So it's really a basic 1080p codec. It's just standard 1080p video. It's not 422 10-bit video like most other high-end video cameras are nowadays, and it can record this 1080p video in 24 and 30 frames per second. Now, this camera also has multiple customizable picture profiles, so it has a standard Rec. 709 profile, it has a wide dynamic range profile, a C-Log profile, which is Canon's log format, as well as a bunch of other formats in between that you can pretty much customize however you need to. So that allows you to really set your picture profile how you want it exactly, and you can go really in-depth to change this to exactly fit your needs, which is super nice. Now in C-Log, this camera has up to 12 stops of dynamic range, which is pretty impressive, especially for the age of this camera. And it records to standard SD cards and has dual SD card slots, which is another great feature. Then last but not least, this camera has a base ISO of 850 in C-Log, and in general, the ISO performance of this camera is pretty solid. I can recommend pretty much using anywhere from the lowest all the way up to 2500 ISO is pretty usable with this. And of course, it gets pretty noisy once you go past that. However, I was pretty surprised at the amount of usable ISOs this camera has. And when it comes to the price of this, you can pick the C100 up for anywhere between $800 and $1,000 used. But in my opinion, it's definitely worth that $800 to $1,000 price point because of the insane amount of features this camera has and just how much of an all-in-one package it really is. And so after a lot of use with this camera, I want to go over some of the main features that I noticed of this camera that I really like, as well as some of its issues that I definitely noticed while using it. So first of all, the 1080p video coming out of this camera is very sharp compared to other 1080p video. So I really love how good the 1080p video out of this is. Of course, it's not as good as 4K and 6K or anything like that. However, it is still sharper than pretty much any other 1080p video out of a similar camera. And then probably my favorite feature of this, the thing that really separates it for me from like DSLR and mirrorless cameras, is the built-in ND filters. I really love not having to thread on a variable ND filter to the front of every lens, and every time I change the lens, switch it out to a different one. One of those little pet peeves that isn't a super big deal, having to thread on an ND filter to the front of your lens, but it's just so much easier and the workflow is just so much better having built-in ND filters in a camera. Now another amazing feature of this is the battery life. So I use this Wasabi Power, basically off-brand battery for this camera. I got it off Amazon. It was pretty cheap, and I did a test with this and I recorded for 6 hours straight before the battery died on this camera with one single battery. So one battery will pretty much last you a full shoot. You know, maybe if you have 2 batteries just for a backup just in case, it might be a good option, but you really don't need more than 1 battery unless you have like a full day video shoot. That's another great thing about this camera, you just really don't have to worry about the battery. And then just the ergonomics of this camera is another amazing feature. Like I said, it has a built-in top handle and side handle, all those buttons on the side for changing all the settings without really having to dive into the menu. Has a bunch of output options, XLR inputs, 3.5mm mic inputs, a pretty decent sort of articulating screen, as well as an electronic viewfinder. It pretty much just has everything you need and everything that you typically rig a camera out to have, just built right into it. But like I promised earlier, now it's time to get into some of the big issues of this camera. So first of all, it cannot record any sort of video past 30 frames per second, which in turn means you can't record any sort of slow motion with this camera, which is something a lot of people use. You know, a lot of people record 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second to get nice, smooth, slow motion B-roll, or really whatever you'd need a higher frame rate for. This camera just can't do it all. And so that's one of the big limitations for me, because I usually record in 60 frames a second for pretty much all of the B-roll I capture for anything, any product video B-roll, or just in general B-roll of anything. I typically record in 60 or 120 frames a second, and basically this camera just can't do that. So if you need any sort of slow motion, this camera isn't for you. Next up, the codecs this camera records in. So like I said, it's 8-bit 420 H.264 codec. So even though this camera can record in C-Log, the 8-bit 420 codec that it records that in just is not very good for color grading. And as soon as you get in your editing software and start pushing the colors around, the footage will definitely fall apart pretty quick. And it takes a lot of experience and a lot of messing around with it to really dial in the colors without just degrading the image quality. So it really sucks that they added a professional picture profile like C-Log into this camera while still having an 8-bit 420 codec. That's one of the big downsides of this, especially if you shoot in C-Log. Now this next one isn't a super big deal, but the XLR inputs on this camera are both on the top handle. So if you need to remove the top handle to fly this on a gimbal, or if you just need a smaller form factor without this huge top handle on the top, you're not going to have any sort of XLR inputs, and it's going to limit you just to the 3.5mm mic input on the side of the camera. And so I would have liked what Sony does with some of their cameras, which is putting one XLR input on the top handle and then one XLR input just on the body of the camera. So if you do remove the top handle, you can still have at least one XLR input if you just need a smaller form factor without the top handle. And so there we go. That is my thoughts on the C100 in 2022. This is seriously one of the most versatile cameras you can get for under $1,000. Definitely let me know in the comments if you're interested in buying this camera or if you already bought one, and just let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments. But that's it from me. I'll see you guys in the next video.